Law of eminent domain is basically the public's right of a public agency to acquire land and pay just compensation for it. And what the Fifth Amendment says is that no private property can be taken for a public purpose without due process of law and the payment of just compensation. So it's inferred from the Constitution, but it is a condemnation right that can't be stopped if there's a true public purpose.
Albert Hawes was putting shingles on a two-story ranch house on the island. And the marshal served papers, he said, don't put another shingle on this roof. As of now, this land belongs to the United States government. You have 10 days to remove all livestock and personal belongings. Anything left after that time will be shot.
We did not sell that land. We got paid for the land later, but we did not sell it. We were not asked to sell, we were not asked to lease. We were just told, get off.
Congress does make a decision that it has to have that piece of land and it has to build this project. The agency has its marching orders.
They just flat didn't want to get out. They didn't want to take the money, they didn't want to have anything to do with it, but they had no choice.
The Hawes men were all fighting for their country and their homeland. Their own country was taking their home from them. That's it in a nutshell as far as I'm concerned.
For the same reason that they took it, is the same reason we were going to get it back. Politics.
The island itself is about 38 miles long and varies between 2 to 3 miles wide. And its topography is essentially the same, up and down. It's broken into a salt marsh along its backside, a grassland along its middle. Then you get into the sand dunes behind the beach itself, and then you're into the open Gulf. The island, I think, has weathered human activity real well because the main activity is ranching. And as long as the ranchers didn't totally denude the sand, they didn't do that much damage to it.
H.W. Hawes, who was my great-grandfather, was born in 1798 in Caroline County, Virginia. And he came to Port Connor as a lawyer. He was a lawyer, very wealthy man for his day and time, in about 1839. And he foresaw Pascavallo as being the entrance to Matagorda Bay and of all commerce to West Texas and Mexico and so forth. And he foresaw it becoming another New Orleans. So he made steps to purchase land, and he acquired land on Pascavallo on Matagorda Island on the north end, and set up warehouses and receiving. Well, he was really prospering, and then Civil War came along, and at the end of the Civil War, he was burned out. Everything was destroyed. All he had left was his ranching operations. And he expanded his ranching operation and kept trying to build back the town of Siluria. And he died in 1883 and is buried over there. Big tombstone practically overlooking Pascavallo near his home.
There were isolated ranch houses, maybe a dozen, up and down the island. And each rancher had his little part of the island cross-fenced. And he didn't have fences along the shore, he didn't need them. He had it cross-fenced. And they made their primary living off cattle, but boy, they had sheep, they had goats, they had horses, everything you can ordinarily see on a farm at that time. Then they did try, I'd say, more garden crops than farming. And then they had their own fishing and hunting without hardly any legal laws of any sort, so they lived off the sea. But it was a subsistence existence.
It was a pretty rough life, really, but everybody, the families that over there, sometimes they'd gather up in old Model Ts and go down to Panther Point and get oysters, open oysters, and bring them back for everybody and picnic there. And somebody wanted a deer for everybody, somebody'd go down there and kill a deer and bring it back for everybody. There's no refrigeration. You had to handle the stuff. Same with fish. When you catch fish, everybody ate them. In Puerto Cana, there wasn't much income in them days. There were no fishing parties as such then. And you either had to shrimp or be in the cattle business. And we shrimped, raised cattle, we shrimped, and we fished. Them, you could sell fish in them days. And at one stage, we built this combination started out as an old pontoon and a Ford, and we put running gear under it, put propeller on it, made it amphibious, put a big reel on the back where we could fish on that Gulf Beach and with them rough seas and all. And it worked real good, but the fish prices got so bad that we finally had to abandon it.
As I experienced life in the 1920s and 1930s, it was still very primitive over there. And I'm sure our ancestors experienced the same thing. There was no running water, there was no indoor plumbing, there were no electric lights, no telephones. Communication had to be through the Coast Guard and through the lighthouse boat, which would come to the mainland once or twice a week. So life was very, very primitive.
There was quite a life over there. Everybody enjoyed it, really. People was attached to the place.
We went swimming up to the cove near the old Coast Guard station, or we'd go to the Gulf Beach. We'd climb the sand hills. We would, of course, ride horseback when we had a chance to, and play with the calves and the sheep. We did have some geese there at the ranch and chickens. I remember climbing on the roof of the ranch at night. I don't know how I got up to the roof of the ranch, but I would climb up there at night and watch the lighthouse light circle around. And I remembered I could say an Our Father between the light turning and till it came back again.
I always enjoyed going over there. That was most likely the only time I got to go over there. Once in a while, we would go over for just a short day of work, like fixing windmills or something like that. And part of the time, we'd go down to the beach and maybe fish or go swimming or something like that, or just walk and gather up shells and things like that. But that wasn't a really work day. That would be more like a fun day.
It's always been a pleasure to go over there. In fact, when I go over there, I don't want to come back cross. And I don't suppose it appeals to everybody like that. It might not me anymore. It might just be my memory, you know, but there is something about it that draws you to it.
It was a good living, but it wasn't a money living, but it was good, healthy living. Everybody made it. When we worked cattle, well, they come from everywhere. All the owners come together, and sometimes we had 30, 35 horses, horseback riders. And we'd start at one end of the island and go all the way through Brandon, marking.
Most of the time we went over so they could get the cattle ready to ship. And so that entailed rounding up the herd, cutting out the calves, and branding, and waiting for the trucks to come. The trucks were loaded at the ranch house. Then they were taken down to the ferry, put on the ferry, and moved across.
Oh, the typical day started with making breakfast for about 20 to 30 to some odd other people. And that was like getting in the kitchen and making coffee and cooking the breakfast and everything for the hands that were doing the cow driving and whatever else they had to do.
Clara and Marjorie Hawes were the cooks, and they began to cook. They were in the kitchen, they were cooking the bacon, they were cooking that, and I mean a lot of food, because some of those men could really eat.
By the time breakfast was over, and some of us washed dishes, some of us got out of that job, but some of us had to do it anyway. But after that, then it was all time, then you didn't have much time between that and lunchtime. You had to start fixing lunch for them. And once in a while, if we had things really well on the hand, we'd play cards or dominoes or something in between meal times. But then some of that, after the supper, the late meal, some of them played poker. I never was a good poker player, so I didn't play poker. They played till sleep time, then they'd go on to bed, and then the same thing would start over the next day.
We went to working cattle in the afternoon, doctoring for worms, and the sheep, they had sheep there. They were full of grass burrs. And I remember one time, Temple was there, we was in the pen with the sheep, and he fell down in a cloud of dust, and I was parting the sheep, looking for him, you know, and jerked him up out of there. They were stomped all over him, you know. He was scratched up with the grass burrs. And we had a big time over there.
Oh, they worked so hard, they had to. If you were a boy and you went over there, you literally got shoved into that pen to throw calves. I guess it was a rite of initiation, I don't know, but it went on every time he went there. And of course we felt sorry for him. Sometimes those cattle could slam them up against the fence. You know, you were in a pen with some pretty wild animals. They might have been called calves, but remember how big they were? Those were not all little calves. Everybody worked so hard. Remember, nobody slacked. Everybody worked hard. It was a job that you loved to go and you loved to do. I mean, the hard work and the being hurt wasn't fun, but it was something, because at that time a roundup had a purpose, because you were going to load those calves into those trucks and you were going to take those trucks off and going to get some money, and that was nice.
We're still in the cattle business. We keep a few scattered here and there, and it's been bad years and some good years. Right now the prices are good. They were terrible for several years. You couldn't even make ends meet. But it's a vanishing profession for a little man.
Can't you hear me when I call? Big ball friend, can't you hear me when I call? Well, you ain't so big, you just told us all.
In the 1930s, Clint Murkison out of Dallas decided he wanted to buy Matagorda Island. And he tried to buy it and found out they didn't want to sell except for the people down here on the lower third of the island, the Brundrettes. They decided finally, okay, we'll sell out. And so Clint Murkison bought it in the 1930s. It was piecemeal, it took a little while. And then he kept the land until 1946, when he in turn sold it to a business partner of his named Toddy Lee Wynn.
Originally, American Liberty Oil Company, which was owned by Clint Murkison Sr., who was in Athens at the time, Athens, Texas. He had been out fishing, and my grandfather had worked for him. Toddy Lee Wynn Sr. had worked for him as a lawyer, and Clint was down on the coast fishing, and his boat broke down, as the story goes, and was walking down a road to this house that he saw in the distance. As he walked, he flushed probably 10 to 20 coveys of quail just going everywhere. And as soon as he got his boat repaired and got back to the mainland, he called up to Dallas, or to Athens, I believe at the time, is where the office was, and said, "Toddy Lee, start leasing all this land down here. It's the best quail hunting I've ever seen." We had 11,000 acres, and we used all that land for grazing cattle, beef master. My grandfather was big into beef master cattle. And also we would go hunting, quail hunting, fishing, and bird watching.
First of all, Mr. Murkison bought it as a working cattle ranch. And he had mongrel Brahma cattle, which he used out here. He was never particularly interested in the ranch, but I think it was partly a tax write-off that he kept ranching it. But he particularly came out here with his extended family and his friends, and he hunted, and he fished, and he shot jackrabbits, and he chased rattlesnakes. He did anything he wanted to do. He just enjoyed it. And when he sold it to Mr. Mr. Wynn still liked it for recreation, but he was a dyed-in-the-wool rancher, and he got rid of the old stock, got Santa Gertrudis cattle, ran it as a more high-grade ranch. I think it was a better run facility under Mr. Wynn, but he still used it for recreation.
Well, Toddy Lee Wynn had a ranch on the bottom 5 miles of the island. And as far as I'm concerned, he was a wonderful man. Well, he had a beautiful home and outbuildings. It was a ranch. And one wing had, I would guess, 10 or 15 rooms. It was just a long wing that was for guests. And he had a good ranch manager that looked after the place. But all in all, it was a beautiful ranch.
And he had side interests. I think the most popular one that's known about is that he got interested in a private space venture that was being handled by a man out of Houston. And they got a bunch of, I guess I just call them rich people interested. Each one put in $25,000. And this was in 1981. Mr. Wynn decided, well, I will not only put in with you, but I'll let you shoot your rocket off on my island because it's a nice remote place to try. So in 1981, they did try to shoot off a rocket, and it was unsuccessful. They tried a second time, got their investors together again, and in 1982, they were successful in shooting a rocket up.
He was very visionary, from being in the oil industry to doing Six Flags over Texas to doing hotels overseas, the Malta, Hong Kong, Hilton. And then on the day he dies, the rocket he was investing in to go off. I mean, just, it was amazing all the things he was doing. He was a real visionary.
The windmills and the water tanks all stand on solid ground, and the country mailman mutters as he motors into town. The sunlight came and the sunlight went, the stars came out to see. The way I laughed and the way I cried at the way you treated me.
We're probably all here tonight because of my deceased father. If you want to know why, back in the 20s when I was a small boy living on the island, incidentally, our ranch house was about a half mile from a lighthouse. Back north, there's cedar trees there where our ranch house was. Back then, the Air Force from San Antonio came down to the island, and I was with my father when one of the pilots who had landed down there came to my father and said, "Mr. Hawes, do you mind if we land our planes here on this flat stretch of ground?" And my father, who was an honest, easygoing, wonderful man, said, "I don't mind as long as you don't run over some of my cows." And they assured him they wouldn't.
A life-saving station was built on Matagorda Island. That became a Coast Guard in later years. And this Coast Guard station was pretty much a hub of activity in my younger years living on Matagorda Island. And the Army Air Corps, it was then, it wasn't Air Force, it was Army Air Corps at that time. Officers out of Brooksfield started coming down there hunting and fishing. And as the guests of the Coast Guard personnel, they got attached to it, and when the Coast Guard station closed in 1929, they took it over and called it the Matagorda Hunting and Fishing Club. And they expanded the use to bring in guides and vehicles and fishing equipment. They even had caretakers and everything else there, and put in a light plant and all that, and they started using it full blow for recreation.
World War II was coming up, and the military, U.S. military, needed a place where their aircraft could practice dropping bombs and practice radar work and practice using helicopters and strafing machine guns, that sort of thing. So they needed to teach the pilots how to use the equipment. Well, they needed a remote area to practice in. And I don't know how they hit on the barrier islands off the Texas coast, but they decided in those days, well, here's a nice remote site, and particularly we like this because it's easy to keep the public out because it's out at sea, and it's pretty easy then to be sure you don't have public in the way. So I'm not sure how they chose Matagorda Island as the best place to do this, but they chose Matagorda Island and the adjacent Matagorda Peninsula. And once they decided this was a good spot, then the only way to get the land was by condemnation because the people who owned it didn't want to sell it.
The actual agency that wants to use it, in that case, it would have been both the Air Force and the Army, or Army Air Corps, if you will, not the Corps, would have either seen it through aerial photos or been generally familiar with the long configuration for runways and bombing ranges. And in such a use, they're going to look for a place that's not in a civilized area, or not a very populated area.
So once the condemnation proceedings went through, I think they went through hurriedly. In 1942, all of the families had to be off the island with their belongings, with their stock, everything off.
My Uncle Albert Hawes was putting shingles on a two-story ranch house on the island. When the marshal served papers, he said, don't put another shingle on this roof. As of now, this land belongs to the United States government. You have 10 days to remove all livestock and personal belongings. Anything left after that time will be shot.
He had a gun and a badge. They always felt a little bit, you know, everyone did. Why did he have to come in that way? But that's the way it was.
Of course, they were just dumbfounded. They had no preparation for this order, and they worked frantically. They got men to come and help them. They worked frantically day and night. They were just exhausted after the 10 days. They got as many of their sheep and cattle off as they could. They sold the sheep for $1 a head, which was just nothing at that time.
They did not have any land on the mainland to go to. They had to look around to, now this is Mr. Alfred Hawes. He had to hunt for someone he might know who had some acreage that they could lease to him. Some he had to sell. I think he had to sell all the sheep.
We'd been there over 100 years, the family had, and he couldn't believe it. And there was no way they'd get everything off there in 10 days. But anyhow, they tried, and they got an extension finally a little bit.
That just shocked them no end, that you have 30 days, you know, to get thousands of heads of sheep off and maybe 1,000 head of cattle or whatever was on there.
My dad had said if they would just take it, we'd let them use it until the war is over, just for nothing, or at least lease it, but they wouldn't hear of it.
My husband, for one, told them to take it, use it, you know. They didn't have to condemn it and put us off.
We tried every way in the world to get them to lease the land instead, but no, they wanted a title. We have documents from the Corps engineers directed to the Army Air Corps to why not let's lease this land. The owners are willing to lease it. They don't want to lose the land. They want willing to lease it to you. It'll save a lot of money and do a tremendous amount of red tape to do that. And we got the directive back from the general in charge. He said, we want the title. And they pursued the title. They wanted that title.
The U.S. would have normally acquired fee title where it was going to build permanent structures. That's the policy then. It was the policy today. Like, we wouldn't normally build a building like this that we own or a base on lands unless we had fee title. It is common to rent bombing ranges, or it was in those days, lands, or even for runways, that we weren't going to build the base itself on. That was oftentimes acquired in lease or easements. And in both of those situations, it's much easier for the owners to ultimately get their land back when the need expires for it.
Roosevelt, had come down to tarpon fish, and he'd come down to Port Aransas. And now he was just the sort of person that Clint Murkison and Toddy Lee Wynn and the people in this area, they would know either personally or the president would know them. So as soon as they heard the president was coming down to tarpon fish, they invited him here to Matagorda Island to have lunch here in the lodge, and the president accepted. And so it was simply an informal lunch. I don't know what they talked about or anything, but it was just a little itinerary that they thought it'd be a feather in their cap to say the President of the United States once was sitting here in the lodge at Matagorda Island.
He was down fishing, and my grandfather invited him over to spend the night, but he could only come for the day. So he came over, spent the entire day, and they would drive around with greyhounds chasing rabbits, and he really got a kick out of that, my grandfather said. And he said he was a great man and really enjoyed the island.
And President Franklin Roosevelt was their guest down there. And I can't say that his visit had anything to do with him taking all 28 miles of Matagorda Island up to the wind fence and not taking it, but it appears to be that way.
Do you think that at that time Murkison and or Wynn knew of the plans for the military base and talked to FDR about that at the time?
I imagine they did, and I imagine that's part of what they talked about. And I imagine that's part of the reason no bombs were dropped down here.
Do you think that they discussed the condemnation of the island and negotiated a lease arrangement for the southern end?
I'm sure that could have been the start of the conversation, or maybe that's where it all came from. I really don't know if that happened at that or not, but he did get a lease, or did lease it to the government and retained ownership.
Our system, Congress is, you can get legislation influenced, obviously, if it's for a good public purpose.
The sad part about it, that as soon as we got the cattle off of there, the people that owned the other end of the island, the southwest end of the island, the Clint Murkison, Toddy Lee Wynn interests, as soon as we got off of there, they run their cattle a full length of the island on the Air Force range that they had condemned and taken. And they'd continued that for a period of 7 years, while our parents was on mainland trying to hold a few cattle together.
And after the government took the ranch, and my brothers went over to the island after it had become a bombing range, they noticed all these cattle around the airplanes, and they said, well, where did these cattle come from? And they said, oh, these are Toddy Lee Wynn's cattle. He just opened the gates after the Hawes moved off. And so his cattle had full range of the island after we moved off.
Hugh was really perturbed because he did his gunnery on Matagorda Island, and as part of his gunnery, they had the wind cattle was all over the island. They had to run the cattle out of the way before they could even fire.
Why would our cattle have been handicapped or interfered any more with the government operation than Toddy Lee Wynn's cattle?
You got to understand that Wynn was just a shrewd businessman, and he took advantage of everything he could. Of course, I guess that's how he got that wealthy. But it was hard for us, who was on the lower end of the money end especially, to understand why they could treat people so different.
Lonesome and cold from my head down to my shoes, but my poor heart still beating, and I got them weary blues.
The air base, I think, was intact by 1942 or thereabouts. And from that time on, that was strictly off limits to anyone except military personnel. They had a lot of people living right there on the north end. And then airplanes came in 24 hours a day from Louisiana, from Austin, from Corpus, from all over. And of course they were coordinated, and they had bunkers and targets and whatever. The idea was to teach the pilots to target practice. And they were using some kind of special radar machinery that they were trying to learn.
February the 6th, 1941, they had a hearing in Victoria County Courthouse. The meeting was conducted by Major Hewitt, Corps Engineers, But at this public hearing, which was overflowing with people, a standing room only, he assured owners that when there was no longer needed for military purposes, they'd get the land back. It was that simple.
After the condemnation hearing, I know when the general told them they would get their land back after the war was over, I guess it was, well, a little easier to take, I guess, is what you'd say, but it still was not a good thing.
There may have even been statements made by some of the military officers, but they don't control the Congress and they don't control the congressional authorizations.
Well, the people in them days believed what the federal government said. He was a spokesman for the government. They had to believe what he said to be fact and binding.
That was probably a public hearing and not a courtroom hearing, although it may have been held at the courthouse. A general would not have been presiding over the condemnation hearing. It goes to a civilian court. Condemnations to any federal district court, just like up here in Galveston or up in Houston. So my guess is that was at a public meeting of some sort where there wasn't actually transcribed, there wasn't a court report. Now, I'm just speculating, but there's no reason that a general would be presiding over a condemnation hearing. None that I could ever think of.
My brothers then volunteered to serve during World War II because they thought this would be an effort to get the land back, and that's really what they were fighting for. One in the Air Force and one in the Navy. And then one of our cousins was killed in Japan, over Japan during the war. He also was one of those who had lived on the island.
All of us that was of age practically went into service in World War II. Everybody was patriotic, and you could understand them needing it for training, war emergency, and nobody disputed that.
We would be glad for the government to use the island for national defense if we were willing to give our lives, you know, we'd definitely be willing to sacrifice the land for the duration of the war.
Like Hugh said in one of his depositions, one of his interviews with National Geographic correspondent, he said, this is what we went to war for, this is what we were fighting for, this is our part of America that we was fighting for. And here we come home and they got a lock on it, and, you know, they didn't do what they're supposed to. And that's saying it all, really.
The Hawes men were off fighting for their country and their homeland. Their own country was taking their home from them. That's it in a nutshell as far as I'm concerned. And it's unbelievable.
Civil Action 55 took all of Matagorda Island up to the wind fence, 28 miles of it, right at 19,000 acres. And it took all of Matagorda Peninsula up to the Colorado River from Pascavallo. And the peninsula belonged to the Hebners, the Covers, the Bramans, and Phillips, and very wealthy people. They built an identical base on both of them practically, and they used them for the same wartime purposes. After the taking, they separated it, and they put Peninsula, and was still Civil Action 55, went into the Galveston district, and Matagorda Island became Civil Action 22 from then on. 4 years after the Matagorda Island was taken, the owners were forced to accept a practically $7 an acre price for the improvements and all. And at the same time, they turned around and gave Matagorda Peninsula back to the former owners and paid them a lease for it.
Law of eminent domain is basically the public's right of a public agency to acquire land and pay just compensation for it, but it is a condemnation right that can't be stopped if there's a true public purpose. It originates way, way back in the English common law. In the United States Constitution, it never really says eminent domain. What the Fifth Amendment says is that no private property can be taken for a public purpose without due process of law and the payment of just compensation. So it's inferred from the Constitution, and it's been around for years. The procedures have changed sometimes over the years, but for the most part, the law has been in effect ever since the sovereign's been around. It's not just the United States has it. I mean, states have it, cities have it. You wouldn't have an interstate highway system without condemnation, for example. First, they would get title policies, then they would get appraisal reports, negotiate with the owners. If they could cure the title to where you could acquire the title without eminent domain, they can negotiate a voluntary price with the owners. If you can't reach an agreement on price that's acceptable to the agency, then the agency will refer the case to the Department of Justice, who actually does the condemnation on behalf of all the federal agencies. Then there would be a trial, and the rules of civil procedure, federal rules of civil procedure, they can either be tried to a 3-person commission that the judge would set up, or to the judge themselves, or to a jury.
Normal procedure is, when they need something for military purposes, they approach the owners and see if they can work out a deal with them. If they can't make an agreement, condemnation is the very last resort. In our case, first we even knew about it when the U.S. Marshal served papers on the owners.
The younger crowd had gone off to the war and didn't get back till what, 45 or 46 or wherever there. So the older men were the ones that took care of the thing there. Joe's dad and Pat's dad and the other 2 Hawes boys from Seadrift. And they were the ones that kind of held it together all that time.
After the war, through some very influential people, Mr. W.H. Bauer, one of them in Port Lavaca. And he wrote to the congressman in Washington, said that wasn't no reason for one family to suffer the big loss of livelihood, and it wasn't no reason, since we was going to get a land back anyhow, that we couldn't go back on a preferential grazing lease. So in 1947, they had a hearing in Houston, and they agreed to lease us half of the condemned land that was taken, give us 5-year highly conditional lease. At the same time, they give the Wynn Murchison interest a 10-year lease on the other half of the condemned land, even though none of theirs was taken.
They were very pleased that they were going to go back over there under a lease, and I mean, this was to my notion, they were getting their foot in the door, which, you know, they still thought there would be a chance of getting the island back. In any case, a lease was a godsend.
Once we got back, it wasn't all peaceful, because they kept thinking up things for us to do, restrictions and this and that. You know, we had to build the fences around the runway. We had to cut down on the cattle, the head of cattle, and every animal, including the horses, was counted as a unit or something, and we had to cut back on the horses, everything, you know, trying to have more cattle.
Anyone who had ranch property on Matagorda Island was allowed to lease, which meant that even though Toddy Lee Wynn didn't have his property taken from him, he was still a resident of Matagorda Island, so he was also included in the lease. So that is how he moved his fence line up from where he actually owned property.
We still, see, at that time, thought we was going to get our land back, because the Surplus Property Act was in effect, but they wouldn't surplus it. So we was tickled to death to get back over there, because we just knew we was going to get it back. And oh, it's just like a different world. Everybody was in hog heaven, so to speak. When they formed the Surplus Property Act, the congressional records show that they were real positive about wanting that land, get it back in the hands of the farmer owner as soon as possible after the war. And that's what the Surplus Property Act was about. It gave the farmer owners priority of acquiring that land back at the taking price or the market value, whichever was lesser. Well, that sounded good.
Then they found out that they were not going to be allowed to get the land back, that some act had been passed in Congress.
After the 1949 Real Property Administration Act was passed, From then on, every piece of fee title property, that means something that you actually own the land, not just an easement or a lease, had to go through this pecking order procedure. Generally, it would be screened through other federal agencies to see if they needed the land. If it wasn't needed, then it's offered up to state and local agencies at fair market value, and then if not, it ultimately goes on public auction. In fee title, Congress sort of preempted that by 49, and a lot of this land had not been declared excess by the military as of 49, so it probably got caught in that 1949 Real Property Administration Act.
49, they changed the Surplus Property Act to do away with the farm owners' rights. And that's what killed us.
When they took the island, there were leases with oil companies. And of course, those were dropped by the wayside when they took it over.
When they paid this $7 court award, in our case, 4 years after it was taken, well, if you didn't agree to take that $7 and wouldn't sign in the papers, you lost your minerals.
And this was the first case where the minerals and surface were separated, where the government took the surface and we still had mineral rights. However, we couldn't exercise those rights, and the leases we had were dropped. We no longer had any profit from our oil leases.
There was always some excuse. You know, of course, during the war years that would have ended. There were leases before the war. But after, it seemed like time went by and some did go over there and drill, and maybe there isn't anything over there, I don't know. But then we're getting into conservation and the hooping crane. And that would always interfere with a big oil company would want to go over and do things. The hooping crane would be there at certain times.
I do know for sure the federal government has no mineral rights on Matagorda Island. We do have restrictions we can put on a person who wants to get minerals out.
It's not easy to get somebody interested in drilling because of the red tape and regulations.
The mineral estate is very important over there because that's the only chance people had of making any money at all. And they didn't compensate for the big loss of that. And the sad part about it, all the old timers that were struggling to try to make a living, they all practically died before the minerals ever could produce. And now they have such restrictions on mineral development that I doubt ever they will be really developed.
Of course, everything interfered with the hooping crane, the fences, the windmills, and all that. But it was just our windmills, I guess, that interfered. I don't know why some things interfere with the hooping crane on the island, but it doesn't interfere anywhere else.
That's another misleading thing. The hooping crane never was on Matagorda Island itself. It was down on the other end down there, but never was on any portion that we were on, or the Hawes Company was on at that time.
One year, the refuge claimed they didn't have enough money to hire anybody, and I kept track of them when Frank Johnson was the refuge manager. One year, I kept track of them for him and called him up and tell him where they were. But they're on the marshlands. They don't get up on the highland. Matagorda Island, if you look at the map, the highlands are well away from the bay as a rule. And where our cattle was, the nearest I'd seen them was, I'd say 3 or 4 miles from the closest our cattle could get to them. There was never a threat to the hoop crane. And the wind cattle, of course, was there too, but the cranes was on the marshland. That's where they fed. That's where they stayed.
We had Washington in here, some high-ranking people from Washington. I don't know whether they were Interior Department or not, but they were concerned about the whooping cranes. And Toddy Lee had them down for lunch. And the whooping cranes, I had to shut down all bombing and photo flash missions. And when you stop and think about it, this was during the war, the Vietnam War, and had to shut them down because they might disturb the whooping cranes, which I feel was a little ridiculous. But nothing was to disturb the whooping cranes except when your high-ranking individuals came down from Washington, and we got a helicopter to take them over to see the whooping cranes, and they wanted you to fly down close to make them fly, but you weren't supposed to disturb them otherwise. It was ridiculous.
In the valley, I love the windstorm on the hill. I love the blackbirds in the blue sky, and I love the old windmill.
For the duration of World War II, all the way to 1977, I think, the military was the owner of most of Matagorda Island.
They wanted Matagorda Island as a permanent playground for the higher brass, and we have the documents, in fact, showing how many generals used it, and which was a continuous thing. And when that war was over in 1945, farm owners, by written request, requested that they get their land back, so on and so forth. And Corps Engineer, we got their response saying they'd be notified when it was surplus. Well, it didn't happen. But in the meantime, Matagorda Island sat there on the caretaker status. They didn't even mow the grass. And all they used it for was hunting and fishing.
Yes, we had some high-ranking officers there. General McConnell, who was Commander-in-Chief of SAC, had his commander's conference there one day. No, it was 2 days. They flew in, worked for a couple of days, and a few of them in the evening went fishing. And I'm not sure, but I think 1 or 2 of them may have gone hunting. General Meyer, I think, flew in one day when he was Vice Chief of Staff. He was active duty, so he was actually goofing off because he didn't inspect the base. All he did was fly in, and if I'm not mistaken, he took a turkey.
After the war was over, the military still used the base, but there was a good deal of talk that now it had become a kind of a recreation site. And they were hunting and fishing and not really doing anything because the war was over. And I think that kind of talk finally got back, and so the military decided, well, we're done with Matagorda Island, we don't need it anymore.
In 1975, the Air Force pulled off of there after a report that put them in a very poor light. And they finally gave up and pulled out in 75.
And they speak of accessing the island. That just means the Air Force said, we're moving out in 1978, 77, 78. We're moving out, we don't need this land anymore. And at that time, what you do is, if a federal agency doesn't need real estate, it goes up for grabs to any federal agency that does see need for it.
Through the accessing procedure, if our agency is done with a piece of land, or any agency, the other federal agencies get a chance at that land first before it's turned back to either states, cities, or ultimately the public. As environmental concerns are growing, we're finding that some of the environmental agencies are watching, because if there are excess lands that are suitable for estuary or whatever, it's not unusual for Fish and Wildlife or Parks and Wildlife to express an interest in those lands.
And that's when the Department of the Interior asked to have the land for particularly the purposes of the whooping crane, which at that time was beginning to move onto the island and was overflowing from the Aransas Refuge. So they wanted the north end of the island for that particularly. When it was accessed, the marshes had never been owned by the federal government, they'd been leased, so they just gave that lease back to the state. So the state owned the marshes, the state owned the beach. The federal government owned the island. There was conflict with the state, who simply wanted the island back.
We fought to get the island for the state of Texas. My proposal was that a low-water causeway be built to Matagorda Island, terminating in a parking lot and a camping area.
I'd say the worst thing that could happen to Matagorda Island right now, in my vision, would be to build a causeway.
I had in mind a Disneyland tram sort of affair.
You get a causeway, no longer an island. You've had it. I'd move out of here and never want to see it again if we had a causeway.
The cantonment area should have been leased out for a business center or a something like that. It has a jet-capable airport. There would be room for a golf course.
In no way would I want it developed like, I hate to say, but Padre Island. I wouldn't want it to become another Padre Island at all.
But if we can have it lightly, intelligently used, I like it just the way it is.
All of us worked toward acquiring that land because it would have been a godsend for Calhoun County. Anyway, Interior won.
So then we had to have a memorandum agreement in 1982, I think the first time it was set up. And what the state and the federal government agreed to do was exchange conservation easements. We'll make a refuge out of the marshes and the beach and the island. We'll also let you the state be involved in putting a state park on top of all that and helping monitor the people and the fate of the island. And we had several little minor changes in the memorandum of agreement, but it basically said Texas Parks and Wildlife will manage public access and things to do with people. Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife will manage the habitat as a refuge.
I have no idea what the figures are of the number of people that have gone to the island either to fish or hunt or to look at the Civil War trenches or the lighthouse and this, that, and the other thing. But I can assure you it's not a great number of people. When you think about maybe 100 or 200 people using a 30-mile beach, it's not being utilized very effectively.
Well, when they pulled out, the Interior took over our leases, our grazing lease. And in 1982, they got a Congressman, Bill Patton, put through a bill to ratify an agreement giving it to the Interior Department.
The old man, Wynn, had died. His son had begun to lose interest in the land and wanted to sell it. And rather than have it be sold at public auction or to developers, that's when the Texas Nature Conservancy came in and bought the southern third of Matagorda Island in 1986, with the intent of immediately turning around and piecemeal selling it to the federal government as a wildlife refuge. And that's what happened.
When that happened, my grandfather was deceased. My father was approached by, I believe it was either Timmy Hickson with the Nature Conservancy, but it was somebody with the Nature Conservancy, about buying the island, converting it into a wildlife refuge, protecting it forever, and because that's the business of the Nature Conservancy. And by doing that at the same time that they would sell it at a fair price. They would, the government would pay us a fair price for it. And they did, I believe, I think it was close to $1,100 an acre at that time, which was a fair price for that land.
Texas Nature Conservancy was involved in buying the lower third of the land. They should have a little bit of a special agreement with Fish and Wildlife to exploit their interest in the land once they sold it. They got $1 million grant from the Enron Foundation out of Houston, and they poured that money is basically the way our education program got started. They poured that into our education program and helped us with boat transport and revamping this. This is an old cowboy bunkhouse here where my classroom and things are. They helped finance all that.
I believe there was a good timing. Our family was, our grandfather had just died, and at the same time as part of the family wanted to buy out other pieces of the family, and this was a good opportunity to do it at the time. I mean, being approached and having a good, fair price made sense for everybody. Nobody wanted to give up going down there. I mean, all of us got along, would have a great time down there, and that was very hard for all of us. But at the same time, because it was an era that was going away, and we all knew that, and I cherish those memories today.
And the final transfer was 1988. So that's when it became federal land down here. By that time, to make the story make a little more sense, by 1988, when this became federal land, the northern two-thirds of the island had already been transferred from the military to the Department of Interior and had already become a refuge. So in 1988, the entire island then became an entity, a refuge.
In the mid-'80s, 86, they started it through the Nature Conservancy. They sold it to the federal government for $13,600,000. That's I think 11,502 acres, near $1,200 an acre. And the Nature Conservancy reserved the use of the Wind Lodge and associated facilities for fundraising, and they still have that over there. But that's near $1,200 an acre, and where the owners, way back when they took it, were on our end, not separated by the fence, we got $7 an acre for improvements and all. And it ain't right. It's an absolute disgrace to the federal government.
We gotta stay close together. 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 As we don't want somebody to get ahead of us.
They've been grazing cattle there for more than 150 years, but now wildlife experts say those cattle are a threat to the environment. Could be the final chapter of a losing war the Hawes family of South Texas has been waging ever since November 8th, 1940, the day the federal government first told them to get off their land. The federal government wouldn't give the land back after the war. It did agree, however, to allow the Hawes to lease their old land and continue grazing their cattle. And now things for the Hawes have gone from bad to worse. With the airbase abandoned, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is now in charge, and it wants the Hawes family to move off the island for good.
That the decision we made here about the grazing in particular was done for what we believe is going to be the long-term good of the island itself.
As it turns out, Matagorda Island is an important stop for endangered migratory birds like the whooping crane. Refuge manager Brent Giesentanner wants to make the island hospitable to the whooping crane and hundreds of other species of wildlife that now exist on the land. Unfortunately, the Hawes and their cattle don't fit into the new plan.
As you can see, looking down the dune line here in the grazed area, the dunes become much shorter.
The island's been grazed 151 years, and everybody said it's in best condition it's ever been after being grazed that long. And because one man making a decision, I'm talking about the refuge man, that cattle are incompatible with wildlife, we got to go. One man.
Could you be wrong?
I don't believe I am.
1990, I notified Mr. Hawes that I was not going to renew his grazing permit for Matagorda Island because I determined that was incompatible with the purposes for which that area was established, in other words, for the benefit of migratory birds and endangered species. We offered Mr. Hawes a rather extensive, exhaustive appeal process so that the decision that I made could be reviewed by several levels within the Fish and Wildlife Service, and Mr. Hawes did take advantage of that appeals process, resulting in 3 levels of appeal, and the final decision was assigned to the Deputy Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, Richard Smith. And Richard Smith came out to Victoria, Texas, and heard Mr. Hawes' final appeal on November 16th. On January the 7th, he issued his final decision in accordance with the laws that were the Refuge Administration Act and other laws that apply to the operation of the National Wildlife Refuge System, and my decision to terminate the grazing activities on Matagorda were upheld by the Washington office. And by letter of January the 7th of 1991, Mr. Hawes was notified that he would have 90 days to remove his cattle from the island.
We have about 4 studies on Matagorda Island made by people that was on site there, and they're showing that cattle was the best thing that ever happened to it. And then when we were having to get off, we had a hearing over Victoria with the refuge manager. Giesentanner was there, and a fellow named Richard Smith out of Washington. And they had a report to refute that, just opposite, written by Dr. McAllister, who had been a professor up at Victoria, and he retired. In fact, when they read that, Mr. Smith asked Giesentanner, "Did you have Dr. McAllister write this?" And he said, "Yes, sir." And then he went to work for the refuge system immediately. Still does, as far as I know.
I'd say the main impact would be overgrazing, taking the vegetation off, and then when the wind catches the sand, begins wind erosion. And when cattle are out here particularly, they tend to walk down to the beach at night to get away from mosquitoes. And when they walk down the beach, they have to go through the dunes. And when they go through the dunes, they open a little trench. They like to walk in the same place, and that opens the dunes to wind erosion and whatnot.
There were some in-depth studies made, and there were a lot of reliable, dependable people that knew what they were doing and saying they were in favor of the grazing, but that didn't make any difference.
I recognize that there is a debate regarding the biology of this issue. Our position is that we can demonstrate harm occurring to the island from the cattle grazing, and that when that harm is demonstrated, then we have no choice but to disallow the activity when we're dealing with things such as granting a grazing privilege to a private individual on public lands.
The grazing is definitely a good management tool. Just as definitely, it does not apply to a barrier island. There are all sorts of benefits to grazing, and there are disadvantages, and the chief disadvantages are, on a barrier island, you cannot run so few cattle that you don't hurt the island and still make a profit. So if you have someone who leases an island for cattle, he's got to overgraze to make a profit. Barrier is just too fragile. We don't have the kinds of grasses that will lend themselves to being grazed by stock and still maintain the island. On the mainland, it's a totally different world, but out here, it's just too fragile.
I figure we're environmentalists. Environmentalist is a name that a lot of people have took up, but a lot of them have got to be extremists. They've got off on a cause and went plumb crazy and overboard.
It's not a decision where, in a sense, what goes on a refuge is an outright democracy. It's not going to be a majority rules decision on what happens on a National Wildlife Refuge, because Congress has put some very strict, specific guidelines on me as a wildlife refuge manager that says what I can and can't allow on a National Wildlife Refuge. So what the public may want in a particular area may not be what Congress says we can allow. And I want to make sure that that is clear on this issue here. Majority doesn't necessarily rule, because majority already ruled when Congress was elected and they passed certain laws that says that this is how we have to operate.
We had the public hearings, and from both sides appealed, you know, let's do it this way and let's do it this way. But then again, it was as if we never were really listened to. It was as if they had their mind made up to start with. We'd have the hearings. I think that was a good appeal from Hugh.
I want you all to understand our ties to the island, how we feel about this. We feel like taking grazing away is kind of the last slit of our throat. way.
We sincerely do want to do what we can to alleviate as much of the trauma of this decision as possible, because we fully recognize that this has a severe impact on his operation, on his livelihood. It also has an impact on him and his family emotionally. And we want to do what we can to lessen that as much as we can and still live up to the law that we are charged with, which is to manage the National Wildlife Refuge System within the confines of compatibility as laid out by Congress.
It was if they listened, but they didn't ever really intend to do anything but get the cattle off of Matagorda Island.
We were just given orders, as I remember, to get off by a certain time, and that's all we could do.
And so what happened to the cattle then?
We leased some land at Point Comfort and took the cattle over there.
The last cattle drive just involved everybody, anybody and everybody who could get over there and work. And it was hard work, of course. It was the summer. And I think there were lots of mosquitoes. And everybody worked very, very hard. And it was just a usual hassle. You know, a lot of times there was a hassle. Did the trucks come? Were the trucks going to be there on time? Everybody watched for the ferry to see the trucks come across a bay. But in this case, it was entirely different because everything had to go. And everybody worked hard. And of course, there was the feeling, you know, if you let it get to you, that sad feeling of why you were working. So you didn't go there, you just worked. But of course, the men folks sitting around, it was a sad time. It was a sad time.
The Hawes Cattle Company leased the land over there, the trailer ranch. Apparently that wasn't too good grazing country, and the change in the cattle from the island over to the mainland wasn't good for them either. I think we lost quite a few head of cattle in the transfer there.
The cattle didn't adapt to the land over there, to the pasture. Big part of them died, and we decided just to get out of the cattle business.
It's awful discouraging to think that the old-timers persevered through all the hardships of all these years, and it took our own government to bring us down. I would wish someone at a higher level would say, let's investigate the taking of Matagorda Island.
Where I was getting a yearly salary in my family to live on, all of a sudden it was cut off, and just like nothing.
It should have been returned to the former owners like it was promised, and it was the law at the time.
The government didn't have to be that harsh in taking the land. They could have been a little more kind, taking people's livelihood away from them like they did.
Somehow you think there should be another way than a federal marshal driving up to a place and saying this isn't yours anymore.
The government needed the place, and they considered World War II more important than the desires of the ranchers.
You simply have no other choice but to identify the land that works best for the project and acquire that piece of land.
If it were used for the purpose they said they were taking it, I think we'd look at it differently.
Taking someone's land away, I could never say is necessarily a good thing. I mean, I'm pretty property rights oriented, so I don't know if it was right or wrong. I'm just glad my grandfather got to do what he did and lease it, but I can understand them being upset.
I can see where the ranchers are coming from, but legally, it was done right. That's just it.
We're so proud of our country, and we think we have such a great nation. But there are areas, and especially this incident and situation, where we think that there should have been much more justice done and much more respect for private property and human rights.
The sad part about this, the people that went through all the storms, the hurricanes, the drought, the blizzards, and everything else over there, and all their efforts and land was taken away from them, and people don't pay any attention to it.
Our government took advantage of honest people, ordinary citizens of the United States that were willing to do anything, sacrifice their lives for their country.
I always wanted to get this land back before my father died because this was his life. And he died in 1958. Then I wanted to get it back before my mother died. Well, I mean, they lived over here and all. And she died in 1972.
This was one of the saddest things about Matagorda Island. Everybody, or at least on my husband's side of the family, Hugh's father and Hugh, and maybe Pat too, lost hope. I think Mr. Alfred died because he lost hope.
I know my dad died of a broken heart.
It'll be the end of an era, and I don't know if we had to liquidate and pull everything off. I know what it feel like pulling old H.W. Hawes' grave out of there and taking him off of here. And I'm pretty sure that, I don't know, I'll probably never set foot over here again.
There's a line in Scripture that the Lord says, I will bring you back to the land of your forefathers. And I know it refers also to eternity, to heaven. But I'd like to think one day that we would have an opportunity to go back.
Broken hearts and dirty windows make life difficult to see. That's why last night and this morning always look the same to me. I hate reading old love letters, for they always bring me tears. I can't forgive the way they robbed me of my sweetheart's souvenirs. Memories that can't be bought, that can't be won at carnivals for free. Well, it took me years to get those souvenirs, and I don't know how they slipped away from me.